So first of all, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. It's wonderful to see the auditorium so full of people. I truly appreciate it very, very much. And thank you, Fanya, for this amazing opportunity. It's truly a great honor. So, I will start by just a small anecdote. The older I get and the more child survivors I meet and the more life experience I get and my own children I see growing up, the less I can truly understand how people like Fanya and how other survivors that I know have done actually so well in life. I'll tell you one thing. I went to visit my parents' town in Poland where they grew up with my daughter, who was at the time 14 months old. And there was at the time in that town that used to have 70,000 people, half of whom were Jewish. There was one Jewish woman that lived, that stayed. She was an old friend of my parents who chose to stay there. And she showed me the town, and there was no hotel, motel, nothing there. I stayed with this very nice couple that used to help her. And my daughter was 14 months old, just barely, starting to speak, and she was very cute. And the man meant to say something very nice to me, and he said, if there were a war like that now, I assure you I would have taken your child to save her, which was the most chilling thing that anybody could say. But what am I trying to say to you with that is that it is truly inconceivable to understand what parents had to do and what these children had to go through, and that they managed to live a life after that. So let me tell you a little bit about what we see in the child survivors and the adolescents that I see and that we study. Child survivors have not spoken for many, many years. They were a very silent segment of the survivor population. They learned to be silent as children. They learned that they have to hide who they really were, because if they spoke about who they really were, they would be killed for it. And it became an adaptation to life. It became the way that they lived also for many, many years afterwards, suppressing their real self, being very quiet, blending into the cultures into which they immigrated. They also didn't think that they were real survivors. I remember very vividly many child survivors who said to me, but I'm not a real survivor. I wasn't in the camps. The other reason that they were so silent was because they were often told that it's not possible that they could remember what they went through, which by now, with what we know about the development of the young brain and the impact of traumatic experiences on young brains, we know that traumatic experiences that are not remembered are nonetheless very, very impactful on the brain, remain imprinted, and really influence the structure and the function of the brain for years later. They also didn't think that they were real survivors because most of the children that survived were in hiding. As I said, not in the camps. Those are the children that had a better chance to survive. I wanted to show you right away the other thing, another point perhaps to mention. Not only were they told that they couldn't remember what they experienced, and sometimes they really didn't remember, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. They were also often specifically instructed not to talk about the past, to leave it behind, to move on. And some of them tell me that they themselves did not want to talk about it. They wanted to move on. They were kids. They could assimilate much more easily. They wanted to become Sabras in Israel, Americans in the United States, Canadians. In Israel, in fact, they became the backbone of the new Israeli society. The majority of the first two cohorts of Israeli pilots were child survivors, adolescent survivors. The majority of the two cohorts of the medical school in the Hebrew University were child survivors. They really became the backbone of Israeli society. I want to show you a very short clip. It's only 2 minutes. I don't know how to make it play. Matt? Amanda? Oh.
In 1942, I was 5. My parents told me that to stay alive, I must forget who I was. She hung a sign around my neck. My name is Marish. My parents are dead. She gave me my favorite sugar sandwich and watched me from across the street, fearing I would run after her. I didn't. I stood still. "70 years later, I am back in Warsaw, the city once populated by 500,000 Jews. This is what's left of the Warsaw Ghetto. Why do we return to this haunted past?
Sorry.
Why do we want this self-inflicted pain?
Look at those windows. Somebody's gonna come down.
And I'm digging my nails into my mother's flesh, and I'm asking Mamushu, where are we going?
When all doors had shut, we took the elevator to the top floor of an elegant Warsaw apartment building. She decided to jump and take me with her. The last eyewitnesses of the Holocaust, we were drawn to this non-existing world in search of its physical remnants. We brought with us pieces of our fragile memories, sometimes out of focus, afraid that after us, they will be erased.
Never forget to lie. How does a child build a life on such a maternal imperative? Never forget to lie. At 6 years old. And of course, I'm sure many of us had the opportunity to read Fanya's book and watch the documentary. How do children manage? Because Marian Marzinski, he's a very successful filmmaker. He has a family. He has lived a very productive life. That's the man who made the previous documentary. He lost his parents. Fanya was in hiding for most of the time. Her parents were alive and still there, both of them. Those child survivors or adolescents who had parents who survived feel that they were so much more fortunate, of course, than the children who lost their parents. But even in hiding, after the war, during the war, as Fanya said, a lot of role reversals took place. Children were the ones who often risked their lives foraging for food when they were in hiding, when they were in the ghetto. Many times, children had to be the ones pushing their parents, urging them to try a little bit more, to move another step, to do what needed to be done to survive when parents were almost incapable anymore of doing that. At other times, children tell me how they feel about parents who did not eat the little bit that there was there to eat, but gave it to the child, and what kind of a feeling that leaves with the children. And we'll talk hopefully a little bit more about that. But even what I'm trying to say is, even those who had parents who stayed with them, even those who had parents who were in the same place hiding with them, both child and parents were profoundly affected by their ordeal during the experience and afterwards, the relationship that they had after the war. So what are some of the predominant themes that you hear from children of survivors? You hear a profound sense of abandonment that remains for life. Gabor Mate, whom you can hear also on YouTube on Sounds True, is a psychiatrist who is now in his 70s, and he says his mother just gave him to a stranger on the street when he was 1 year old to try and save his life. He doesn't remember it, of course, but the sense of abandonment, all of us who know what would happen to a 1-year-old when you just all of a sudden disappear. You hand them to a stranger and you disappear. He says the abandonment feelings that he carries with him he was speaking when he was 73 years old. He said, you know, I gave a fantastic talk. People said that it was fantastic. I felt so good about it. And then on the way back home, the airplane upgraded me and put me in first class. I felt like a king. My wife was supposed to come and pick me up from the airport, but she got caught up in something. And when I landed, she said, do you still want me to come, or can you take a cab? It was just a 20-minute ride home, he said. But the feeling that I had was such a profound abandonment that by the time I came home, I could barely look at her. I couldn't speak with her. I felt so abandoned. So this is the impact in relationships 70 years later of that type of an experience, even when it's not remembered. Unclear sense of identity. The children who are very young don't have really memories of their life at home, their parents, their traditions, and they don't have those memories to guide them to. Some people don't even remember their names or the real names of their parents. Their main coping mechanisms, as I said, is one of hiding, blending, suppressing their real self, and that continues also in relationships, causing a great impact on intimacy and on a sense of really people being there. So in a way, if you can't show yourself and if you can't be fully in the relationship true to yourself, then you're sort of reenacting the same abandonment that you will feel because people are not able to be there with you in the same way. For those who survived, as I said, a lot of role reversals, and also for those whose parents were able to not eat and give them the morsel of food or come up with the ingenious idea that somehow saved the family, the parents become so magnified in terms of how wise and clever they were that it makes it very hard during adolescence to do the things that we all need to do in order to separate from our parents and become our own people. It's very hard to differentiate, as we call it. It's hard to become our own selves. I said defying evil because these children and these adolescents that lived through the war, like Fanya, really encountered in those very early years evil. And when I mean evil, I say not just bad things. We all can do some bad things, but evil are actions that really aim, that are intended with a malignant intent to dehumanize other people and use them as an object and as a means to an end. These are intentional acts of malevolence. And the essence of such acts is dehumanization of other people, which means really denying them the things that we think of as what makes people people. And what we know now from neuroscience, which is a new field that allows us to look at what happens in the brain when we're thinking about certain things, when we're evaluating different pictures of people that we're shown. You know, when we look at what happens in the brain, we see that the fact that someone is a person is not really enough for our brain to necessarily see them as a human being. We can actually look at someone and if we take away from them their hair, their name, their characteristics, their clothing, if we put them in the same clothes, if we shave their heads, if we give them numbers instead of names, they become objects to us, not just on a psychological level, but really in terms of the neural activity in the brain. The brain moves the way that we perceive them into a part of the brain, which is actually a part that processes objects and not people. And when that happens, then we can do things to these objects like we do to objects, right? We can drive a nail through a table and not feel badly about it. And if a person is perceived by us as an object, then we can do a lot of bad things to them. So when it's also, by the way, a bi-directional process, not as in the slide, I'm just kind of using it as a guideline. We can also do, by the way, the opposite. As you know, we can look at the yellow sponge and we can give it a face and a name and personality characteristics, and all of a sudden it becomes SpongeBob, a very delightful entity that we can relate to. So it's important for us to remember that there are ways for us to make our brain remember that somebody, or think of somebody or of something even, as SpongeBob, as a human being, as a person. So here is a picture by a very well-known painter in Israel, Paul Kor. He's actually a wonderful writer, author, and painter of children's books. And this is really how dehumanization occurs. Here are the people with their faces, with their personal belongings, and here is the humanoid figure that is already basically an object, and one can throw it into the fire. So where does evil spring from? Evil springs from, unfortunately, that's one of the lessons we learned from the Holocaust, is that evil springs from regular individuals in regular circumstances. It is not something that is confined to pathology, to mental illness, or to particular leaders. That's a misleading, convenient idea to think that it's just because somebody is particularly sick or perverse. Really, the admonition that it will never happen again after the Holocaust has been proven false. Many, many genocides and atrocities have taken place since then, and it makes us think, how come? Who can do it? How can it happen? So what we see actually is that under certain circumstances, communities and states can engage in evil acts. It rises from within, and it shows our susceptibility to social norms and ideology, and how much of our identity is wrapped up in it, because we are, in the end, animals like other animals, and we have a very strong evolutionary influence that is still very much with us. We need to be part of the herd, and when the herd threatens to exclude us, we feel very, very threatened. And social psychology has shown us, some of you have had the chance to hear about these very, very famous studies, that if you show 10 people in the room, two sticks, one is long and one is shorter, and you ask them which is longer and which is shorter. It's a very simple experiment. But if you have 9 people who collaborate with the researchers, and they say the shorter one is the longer one, they point at that, then the last person in the room who's not a collaborator and doesn't know that will end up saying, yeah, that one is the shorter one. We used to think that it's just because people comply and it's not pleasant for them to say something different from the other 9 people in the room. But now that we have neuroscientific evidence, we actually see that it changes the perception in our brain. Social pressure is that meaningful to us as humans, that it actually can change the perception in the brain. And of course, we have other very important studies, such as Milgram, that show that if someone in a coat who's considered an authority to you, like a researcher in a university, tells the students to increase more and more and more the dial on a machine that supposedly delivers electric shocks to somebody in the other room, most people continued to dial it up and up and up, even though they could hear the person screaming, because the authority figure said so. And that's our sensitivity to hierarchy and to authority. And the Zimbardo prison experiment, which had to be stopped after 3 days. Zimbardo divided a group of students to prisoners and the prison guards. He planned to have an experiment for 3 weeks. After 3 or 4 days, it had to stop because the prisoners became so depressed and the prison guards became so sadistic. And these were regular students. So all of those things teach us a lot about the fact that evil does not rise from psychopathology necessarily or from a particularly crazy leader. It really rises from a certain set of circumstances that we're all susceptible to, which is why we have to be aware of them and know what to do about them. Elizabeth, could you just remind me how much time I still have? Excellent. Okay. So what I wanted to speak with you about is another aspect that is very important to me in terms of all survivors of atrocity, which I have come to call the dual reality of trauma. So children who have faced evil, real evil, in terms of terrible sadistic acts that they have witnessed, terribly desperate acts that they have witnessed from people around them in hiding or in the ghetto. You know, my most beloved adopted aunt, you know, a lot of survivors created networks around their family, especially in Israel, of other survivors that were like a substitute family. My favorite aunt was in hiding with 10 other people. She had a 1.5-year-old child. The Germans were very close one day, and the child was crying. The child was suffocated to death by the people in the hiding place because it was the child or all of them. There are many stories like that that I hear in the privacy of my therapy room, stories that child survivors often never spoke about for many, many years. There is a beautiful documentary called Number 4 Our Lady, Number 4 Street of Our Lady, with another story like that. But these stories are only coming out in the open now. So what is the dual reality? What is the dual reality of survivors, and especially of children who witnessed or experienced such atrocities at such a young age? The dual reality is something that I've come to call, and it's the existence after the war of those who have experienced such terrible traumas. They live in what, to me, is like two realities. The reality of the here and now, where they are safe and where they're in a pro-social place where people are supposed to be nice, you're supposed to be, wait your turn, be pleasant, be polite, all of those things. And there's the reality of trauma, which they know of, which cannot be ever put away as something that belongs to another place and another time, because they have seen what people are capable of. They have seen what can happen. And therefore, I say it's like living in a world that's divided by a glass floor. Up above the glass floor, survivors of the trauma and child survivors and adolescents in particular behave according to the prosocial rules of the current reality that they're in. But underneath the glass floor, there is continuously the images and the reality of the trauma, the way they saw what people can do, what people can become, and where the rules of behavior are not about pro-social, desirable behavior, it's about what will make you survive. And why do I say it's a glass floor? Because I'm trying to indicate the transparency of it, the fact that both realities are continuously referenced all the time, but there is a certain back and forth movement between them. Sometimes the top reality is the predominant one, and sometimes the other reality is the predominant one, depending on triggers. Something reminds them of the trauma, someone says something that seems aggressive, and the reality of the trauma becomes much more dominant. So I have a picture here that was taken, a photograph by a friend of mine who's also a child of survivor. And when I showed this to an audience of survivors, whether adults or children, what they see here is barbed wire and emaciated survivors standing in the morning counting in a concentration camp. What it is in fact here, which is probably what you all see, is a simple photograph, naturalistic photograph, not photoshopped, of a vineyard in the snow. Why do I show you this? Because it's a very good example to show you that the inner reality of trauma can totally distort the reaction to stimuli in the present. So for child survivors in particular, whose inner world was so impacted by their traumas, when they see something which is much more complicated than a photograph, when they experience an interaction, interpersonal interaction, or a social or political situation, how much more are they likely to respond emotionally from the place of trauma when there is something there that evokes it? So what I'm saying is that reality very much interferes or can color our survivors' reactions to current stimuli. For the child survivors that were very young, as I said, and don't have memories, there is another thing which is a void in their sense of identity, a void in their sense of who they are, which is not something that is not there. It is a presence. It's a presence in their psychological world. It's a presence of a whole. It's not nothing, it's a whole. Who am I? Where am I from? Who were my parents? And a sense of longing and missing, which the child felt when he was handed over to the stranger. It's a contentless sense of void, which remains with them often for many years. What do we see in studies when we compare orphan child survivors and those who survived with parents? So survivors who were less than 13 years old were compared to, who had parents that survived and didn't have parents that survived, were compared. And what we see, obviously, is a very strong relationship between the non-survival of parents. So when children did not have parents that survived with them, the severity of the traumatization tends to be much, much worse. And for those whose parents survived, as I said, they were mostly in hiding and not in the ghetto. Those whose parents survived, the parents tended to be from a higher socioeconomic strata and have the possibility to pay for their hiding or know people that were more able to help them. They had more siblings that survived. There was better chance that a sibling survived when the parents survived. They also had a better chance, if their parents survived, to achieve a little bit more higher education after the war. The orphan child survivors suffered much more frequently from symptoms than the other ones, but at least in Israel, there was no difference in the occupational achievements of child survivors that were orphaned and those who were not. Think about it. How crazy is that they managed to do so well? They were looked at also, comparison was also looked at in 1997. That is, 50 years after the end of the war. And those whose parents survived seemed to adjust much better. At 50 years later, their adjustment to life was much better. They were still working more than the others. They had many more friends, and they were much more integrated. They were less isolated. Many more of them married Israeli-born spouses, and they reported that their children were less affected by Holocaust memories if their parents had survived. The orphan children also suffer much more from survivor guilt. So even though they were children and their parents didn't survive and there was very little that they could do, they feel much more guilty somehow about the fact that they did not manage to somehow help their parents survive. And we see impact of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic symptoms, not only in child survivors of the Holocaust, but in children of many, many other nations that survived the war. Finnish, German, English, Polish, Danish, Norwegian, we see symptoms 60 years later in these people, although most of them were very productive and rebuilt their countries, rebuilt their communities, and established families. This is a very interesting, just to show you a picture of the survivors after the Holocaust. They were compared with other people on many dimensions. It's amazing that the differences in all of the other dimensions, such as total level of adjustment to life, physical health, psychological well-being, cognitive functioning, all of those things, they were really quite like other people, these children These children were not as damaged as we would have thought. And yet, the big two peaks in the middle, that's post-traumatic symptoms. They were distinctly and very, very much so still suffering from post-traumatic symptoms even 60 years after the war. The risk factors for post-traumatic syndrome are multiple traumata, and we know that in the World Health Organization, when somebody has more than 4 significant traumas that they have experienced, they're much more likely to have a much more severe dysfunctionality or impairment. And children that survived the Holocaust had many, many more than 4 traumas. They had many, many more than 40 traumas. And still, we see this is the ACE study. I think for you as educators, it's an important study to look at. It's online. It's called the ACE study. It was conducted by Kaiser Insurance Company in the United States about the general community, and it evaluates, it checked how many traumas people in the general population of the United States suffer, and it showed an unbelievable, massive connection between childhood traumas. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and when people have more than one adverse event, and certainly when they have more than 4, there are tremendous implications for their health, psychological and physical, for the rest of their lives. We talk about the survival brain and the learning brain, and when children are exposed to trauma, the survival brain takes over the learning brain. Survival becomes the essential goal, and all resources are diverted from the capacity to learn and to enjoy life to survival. And that often is an irreversible state of affairs that stays this way with child survivors and with adolescent survivors for the rest of their lives. So child survivors have a problem with stress regulation. Their brain learned to be on guard all the time. Their stress reaction has not been reset to be normal. They're always anticipating something terrible. They're always anticipating something stressful. And unfortunately, they show elevated levels of cortisol secretion, which is the stress hormone, even 60 years after the war. So very significant change in the biological regulation of stress that remains. Oops. I will skip that. So as for those who were in hiding with the parents, Fanya alluded to the change in the relationship with the parents. We would be often tempted to believe that those who are in hiding with their parents have had it so much easier. They did have it easier in some ways, I suppose, if one can speak in such terms about such terrible experiences. But there were often terrible, terrible experiences also in those circumstances, and we have to ask what happened actually, because sometimes terrible things happened. As I said in Friend's story, number 4 Street of Our Lady, for example, she cried for 3 days. It was very, very dangerous that the neighbor in the village will hear because the houses were very close, and she was actually given by her parents and the doctor that was hiding with them, the other family, she was actually given a pill that was supposed to kill her. And she didn't die, but horrible things did happen, and we have to be very sensitive. You know, a colleague of mine once called me and said that she has an 80-year-old who's very depressed, lived her life very successfully, was a teacher, in fact, was a great teacher, and all of a sudden she's so depressed she can't even take a shower for the past month. And she knows that she's a child survivor, so what do I think about it? Because she knew that I work a lot with survivors. And I said, what do you know about her? And she said, oh, she doesn't want to talk about it, and she doesn't think it's relevant because her father came back from the war and picked her up. And so my colleague, too, bought into it, that it's not so bad because, you know, one parent came back. Well, only one parent came back. Think about it. For Fanya, too, only one parent survived. Does it mean that we don't miss and we don't have horrible experiences related to the one that did not survive? Some children who were not with their parents and some children who were in hiding with their parents were sexually abused by their rescuers. That is something that is only now beginning to be talked about because society was really not ready for a very long time to speak about survivors. Then we weren't ready to speak about child survivors, and we certainly weren't ready for a long, long time to speak about the combination of Holocaust trauma and sexual abuse in children by their survivors. But we all know that when children don't have an adult who's there to protect them, they're very much at risk for all kinds of things to happen to them. When the war was over, and if the child had the good fortune to be with decent rescuers who treated them well, then there was another trauma when the parent returned, and this was often a parent that was very different from the parent that the child remembered. This was often a broken parent or a parent who just became very strange to the child, and the child had another trauma of the separation from the family that they've become attached to. Children had to reconnect with these parents, and often these reconnections were not like we would like to see them in a Hollywood movie. It was not necessarily easy or happy, and often when just one parent came back, the parent remarried. The other parent was often, the step-parent was often also a survivor, sometimes a survivor who lost their own child. It was complicated, to say the least. And some parents had great difficulties. This is what I hear from many of my child survivors who actually did reconnect with a parent or with parents. Parents had a very hard time speaking with their child about what happened to the child during the war, because I can only imagine, and it's really something that our minds refuse to go there, to really think what a parent might have felt when they reconnected with their child and had to imagine or to think what this child went through. And then finally, the trauma of reintegration. When children came to this country or to Israel or to Canada, they often could not stay with their parents. The parents had to rebuild themselves. They had to work hard. They put them in foster care. They put them in kibbutzim in Israel or in boarding schools. And even when they didn't, there was a huge trauma of re-entry into this new society where other children were regular, normal children, and child survivors and child and adolescent survivors were these old children who have been through hell and back. And like I said before, even those whose parents were very, very helpful in orchestrating their survival had their own issues in separating from parents that showed themselves to be always right and that made it possible for them to survive when nobody else did. Well, then how can you have a rebellion as an adolescent, as an American adolescent now, or a Canadian adolescent? How do you rebel against such a parent that saved you? You know what they've been through. You have all of that baggage with you that you should not upset this parent who has been through so much. And it's the parent whose wisdom and whose initiative proved so true. How can you go against them? So that's about adolescent disengagement. And child survivors, when they're compared to peers in adulthood, as I said, we see more dissociative symptoms. Dissociative symptoms come in all kinds of ways. There are all of those types of phenomena where somebody is not really there fully, when someone is disconnected and goes away in their mind to a bad memory, or is just not really fully there with you in various levels of severity. They are less satisfied with their lives despite the fact that they've made tremendous achievements, and they have a bleaker general perspective on life. They perceive current life events as more stressful and more threatening than peers who haven't been through the Holocaust, and they have more cognitive impairment in old age in comparison to people that did not go through trauma. We see that also with veterans PTSD is very bad for the brain, and it's often associated with premature aging, of course with some great exceptions, as we see here in the room. Right? So what we talk about, what we see in child survivors and in adolescent survivors is inhibited mourning. They could not pay attention. They could not direct resources for coping with their losses. They had to move on. I wanted to tell you some examples, but I don't think we have the time. Elizabeth? A few minutes, so we'll see if we have time perhaps later on. They have a lot of negative feelings that they carry with them arising from the separation from the parents, because, you know, children don't really have the capacity at 1-year-old, 3-year-old, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, they don't really have the capacity to understand that parents left them for their own good. It's very, very painful, even if they did understand it, and that stays with them. The uncertainty for, about the fate of the parents, often for years, made it impossible to mourn them and blocked processes of mourning, so that the mourning becomes just fossilized, blocked, and stays with them for a very long time. It also causes often problems in intimate relationships with spouses, but also with one's own children, and a difficulty in responding to one's own child when one's own child needs some comforting, because it evokes it's so threatening that it will evoke all of the sadness and the longing and the pain inside oneself, that they compartmentalize it, they suppress it, and therefore they cannot respond sensitively to whatever regular developmental issues are making their child sad or upset. Healthy and inhibited mourning. So what do we think we need, or people need, for healthy mourning is defined by Bowlby, who is the father of attachment. Attachment is a very important aspect in resilience, and by the success of the child survivors and the adolescent survivors, we are clearly looking at a group that had a very secure attachment with their parents before the trauma. Much like Fanya said, most of them came from very warm, loving families, and the proof is in the pudding, in the way that they were able to survive. Healthy mourning is defined as successful effort of the individual to accept both that the change has occurred in his external world, and that he's required to make corresponding changes in his internal representation to reorganize his attachment behavior. So his attachment, his longing for the attachment figure that is no longer there. And what we see that is required for the success of that kind of mourning that allows us to move on more easily is a secure attachment before the trauma, so a very secure attachment to the parents, and then getting prompt and accurate information about the loss and an opportunity to ask questions and talk about it. That's not what was there for the child survivors. And the presence of a known, trusted parent or substitute adult to turn to. That was also often not there for them. However, this is something that's very important for me to stress to you at the end of this little presentation. You know, I would have shown you this, but you, perhaps anyway, it's in Hebrew with subtitles. It's a documentary about two brothers that were very young when they survived in Auschwitz. And one of the main reasons why they survived was because there was a young woman there who was like in her early 20s, who sort of adopted them and became that trusted other that allowed them to survive. And they say about Auschwitz, they're looking at Auschwitz and pictures, and they say, "Here I learned to love," which means in the depth of darkness, in the depth of atrocities, in the depth of deprivation, when there is one adult that one can be attached to, that one feels cares about you, that one feels is interested in you, you can learn to love even there. Thank you very much.